Good morning, sixth grade. Welcome back. Happy Monday. I'm sorry I'm not here with you today, but I will see you all in a little while. So, today we're going to start on Chapter 5, Lesson 1 with Ancient Egypt and Cush. And these will be one of the first grades on the second quarter. So, make sure you're staying up to date on your assignments and you're completing them when I assign them so that you do not fall behind on these. All right, so let's go ahead and get started with our chapter opener.
The story matters. When you think of the most powerful person in your country, who is it? Is it the president? For ancient Egyptians, one of the most important beings was the god Osiris. Osiris controlled the power of life and death. As the god of agriculture, he controlled the very food Egyptians ate. He allowed the Nile River to flood its banks and bring fertile soil and water to the Egyptian desert. Osiris also knew death. In the underworld, the souls of the dead met the god Osiris. He did not have the power to return the dead to life, but he was a symbol of ongoing life. As you read this chapter, you will learn how the forces of life and death shaped the daily life of the ancient Egyptians and Cushites.
All right, so let's look at our essential questions for chapter 5. And we have these essential questions right here. It says, how does geography influence the way people live? What makes a culture unique? And why do civilizations rise and fall? So we're going to think about these questions as we read our lessons and in this chapter. All right, so you should have already watched the video. I had that posted in a separate Ed Puzzle video. So we're going to go ahead and start reading Chapter 5, Lesson 1, the Nile River.
Lesson 1, the Nile River. It matters because the Nile River was the most important factor in the development of ancient Egypt. The Nile River Valley. Guiding question. Why was the Nile River important to the ancient Egyptians? While empires flourished and fell in Mesopotamia, two other civilizations developed along the Nile River in northeastern Africa. One of these civilizations was Egypt. It developed in the northern part of the Nile River Valley. The other civilization, Kush, emerged in the far southern part of the Nile River Valley. Although Egypt and Kush were unique civilizations, they influenced one another throughout their long histories. Valley civilization. The Nile River Valley was ideal for human settlement because of its fertile land. As early as 5000 BC, hunters and gatherers from the drier areas of Africa and Southwest Asia began to move into the Nile River Valley. Permanent settlements were created by early groups who farmed the land and built villages along the Nile's banks. These people were the earliest Egyptians and Cushites. The early Egyptians lived in the northern region of the Nile River Valley. They called their land Kemet, which means black land, after the dark, rich soil. Later, this northern Nile area would be called Egypt. Of the world's early river valley civilizations, you probably are most familiar with ancient Egypt. People still marvel at its ruins, located in present-day Egypt. These ruins include the enormous stone sphinx that has the body of a lion and a human head. Archaeologists also study the wondrous pyramids and the mummies found buried in tombs once full of riches. Many of ancient Egypt's structures.
Okay, for some reason, they have this reading on the previous page, and I won't read it on here, so I'm going to go ahead and read this section here. It says, the gift of the Nile. Many ancient Egypt structures survived because Egypt has a hot, dry climate. Since the region receives little rainfall, ancient Egyptians depended on the Nile River for drinking and bathing. The river also supplied water to grow crops. To the Egyptians, the Nile was the creator of all good. They praise it in a hymn.
Primary source. You create the grain, you bring forth the barley, assuring perpetuity, survival to the temples. If you cease your toil and your work, then all that exists is in anguish, suffering. From Hymn to the Nile. Do you know which is the world's longest river? It is the Nile that flows north about 4,000 miles, 6,437 kilometers from Central Africa to the Mediterranean Sea. It has been called the lifeblood of Egypt. At its source, the Nile is two separate rivers, the Blue Nile and the White Nile. The Blue Nile begins in the snowy mountains of eastern Africa. The White Nile starts in the tropics of Central Africa. The two rivers join just south of Egypt to form the Nile River. There, steep cliffs and large boulders form dangerous, fast-moving waters called cataracts. Cataracts make traveling by ship along the Nile difficult. A protected land. As with many rivers, the Nile's flow throughout the centuries has created a valley. You can see on the map on the previous page that the Nile looks like the long, winding root of a plant. Shortly before the Nile reaches the Mediterranean Sea, it splits into many branches that resemble a plant's bloom. These waterways form a fan-shaped area of fertile marshland called a delta. In the Nile River Valley, we see the effect that water has on the landscape. The lush green Nile Valley and Delta contrast sharply with the barren deserts that stretch out on either side of the river. The change in landscape can be so sudden that a person can stand with 1 foot in fertile soil and 1 foot in barren sand. The Nile borders the largest deserts in the world. To the west of the Nile River is the Libyan Desert, which forms part of the Sahara. To the river's east lies the Eastern Desert that extends to the Red Sea. The ancient Egyptians called these deserts the Red Land because of their scorching heat. These large desert areas were not favorable to humans or animals. They kept Egypt isolated, however, from outside invaders. Thinking like a historian. Researching on the internet. As the lifeblood of Egypt, the Nile River was and continues to be essential to daily life in Egypt. It is also important to the other places through which it flows. Use the internet to find reliable sources about the lands through which the Nile River and its tributaries run. Identify 3 facts that you discover about the Nile River from your research and present them to the class. For more information about using the internet for research, read the chapter, What Does a Historian Do? Egyptians depend on the Nile River to grow their crops. We know that the Mesopotamians controlled the floods of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers to grow crops. They developed the technology to do so, but the unpredictable rivers constantly challenged them. In Egypt, however, the flooding of the Nile River was seasonal and consistent from year to year, so the Egyptians did not face the same challenge. Predictable floods. As in Mesopotamia, flooding along the Nile in Egypt was common. The Nile floods, however, were more predictable and less destructive than those of the Tigris and the Euphrates. As a result, the Egyptians were not afraid that heavy floods would destroy their homes and crops. Each year during late spring, heavy tropical rains in Central Africa and melting mountain snow in Eastern Africa added water to the Nile. Around the middle of summer, the Nile overflowed its banks and flooded the land. Egyptian farmers were ready to take advantage of this cycle. When the waters returned to their normal level in late fall, thick deposits of fertile soil remained. How did Egyptians farm? Farmers planted wheat, barley, and flax seeds while the soil was still wet. Over time, they grew enough food to feed themselves and the animals they raised. During the dry season, Egyptian farmers irrigated their crops. They scooped out basins or bowl-shaped holes in the earth to store river water. They then dug canals that extended from the basins to the fields, allowing water to flow to their crops. Raised areas of soil provided support for the basin walls. In time, Egyptian farmers developed new tools to make their work easier. For example, farmers created a shadoof, which is a bucket attached to a long pole that lifts water from the Nile and empties it into basins. Many Egyptian farmers still use this method today. Egyptian farmers also needed a way to measure the area of their lands. When floods washed away boundary markers that divided one field from another, farmers used geometry to help them recalculate where one field began and the other ended. Egyptians gathered papyrus, a reed plant that grew wild along the Nile. They used the long, thin reeds to weave rope, sandals, baskets, and river rafts. Later, they used papyrus to make paper. To do this, the Egyptians cut strips from the stalks of the papyrus plant and soaked them in water. Next, the strips were laid side by side and pounded together. They were then set out to dry, forming a large sheet of papyrus on which the Egyptians could write.
All right, so if you look at the picture that they have over here, you can see the papyrus reeds that are growing along the river. You can see a quick little picture here of them making the paper or the papyrus. Papyrus reeds grow wild along rivers. From harvesting the reeds to the final product, the process of making paper from papyrus took many days. So you can see that there.
How did the Egyptians write? Like the Mesopotamians, the Egyptians developed their own writing system. At first, Egyptian writing was made up of thousands of picture symbols that represented objects and ideas. A house, for example, would be represented by a drawing of a house. Later, Egyptians created symbols that represented sounds, just as the letters of our alphabet do. The combination of pictures and sound symbols created a complex writing system called hieroglyphics. Few ancient Egyptians could read and write hieroglyphics. Some Egyptian men, however, attended special schools to prepare for careers as scribes in government or business. The Egyptians did not write on clay tablets like the Mesopotamians. For their daily tasks, Egyptian scribes developed a simpler script that they wrote or painted on papyrus. These same scribes carved hieroglyphics onto stone walls and monuments. Progress check. Identifying. What kind of writing system did the Egyptians develop? Uniting Egypt. Guiding question. How did Egypt become united? Protected from outside attacks by desert barriers, Egyptian farmers were able to grow surpluses, extra amounts of food. In Egypt, as in Mesopotamia, extra food meant that some people could leave farming to work in other occupations. Artisans, merchants, and traders began to play an important role in Egypt's economy. As more goods became available, villages along the Nile traded with one another. Before long, Egyptian caravans were carrying goods to Nubia to the south, Mesopotamia to the northeast, and other places outside Egypt's borders. Along with the exchange of goods, Egyptian traders learned about the ways of life and governments of other societies. Forming kingdoms. The need for organized government became increasingly important as farming and trade increased. A government was necessary to oversee the construction and repair of irrigation ditches and dams. A government was needed to develop a process for storing and distributing grain during famines. In addition, conflicts over land ownership had to be settled. Over time, groups of villages merged to form small kingdoms. Each of these kingdoms was ruled by a king. The weaker kingdoms eventually fell under the control of the stronger ones. By 4000 BC, Egypt was made up of two large kingdoms. One was Upper Egypt, which was located in the south central part of the Nile River Valley. The other was Lower Egypt, which was located along the Nile River's north delta. Who was Narmer? Narmer was a king of Upper Egypt. About 3100 BC, he led his armies from the valley north into the delta. Narmer conquered Lower Egypt and married one of Lower Egypt's princesses, which unified the kingdoms. For the first time, all of Egypt was ruled by one king. Narmer established a new capital at Memphis, a city on the border between Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. He governed both parts of Egypt from this city. Memphis began to flourish as a center of government and culture along the Nile. Narmer's kingdom lasted long after his death. The right to rule was passed from father to son to grandson. Such a line of rulers from one family is called a dynasty. When one dynasty died out, another took its place. From about 3100 BC to 332 BC, a series of 30 dynasties ruled Egypt. These dynasties are organized into three time periods: the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom. Throughout these three time periods, Egypt was usually united under a single ruler and enjoyed stable government.